Chapter 5 of Doors of the Night by Frank L. Packard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5. The Second-Hand Dealer. The door closed behind Whitie Jack. The man's footsteps echoed back as he climbed the street, echoed faintly again from the pavement, and then died away. Billy Kane got up from the bed, went to the door, locked it, and then walked down the length of the room, and standing in front of the mirror, stared into the glass in a grimly impersonal way. It was himself, Billy Kane. His face was in no whit changed, except perhaps that there was a slight pallor there due to loss of blood, and that the lines were sharper and harder, as though he were, as indeed he was, under a tense and heavy strain. But with his collarless shirt, his trousers covered with mud and dirt, his whole appearance had taken on an aspect that was at once sinister and forbidding. He laughed shortly, and turning abruptly from the mirror, crossed the room again and pushed aside the cretonne hanging. There were some clothes on the wall pegs here. He gathered them up, and took them nearer to the light for an inspection. They were old, somewhat greasy, and wholly disreputable. He laughed shortly again as he changed into them. As the Rat, he might venture out, though he would do well to take care not to be recognized, since Whitie Jack would have spread the report that he was wounded and in bed, but he could at least go out without inviting instant pursuit as the murderer of David Ellsworth. He was safe now, for the moment, safe until morning anyhow, and he could even use those hours, if he would, in an attempt to put as many miles as possible between himself and New York. His hands clenched, and into the pallor of his face the red came burning hot. But he wasn't going to do that. That staggering possibility was clear before his mind's eye now. He wasn't going to do that. He was going, instead, to play the Rat, to play the cards that fate, if one believed in fate, had thrust into his hands. To take the chance, the one chance, if the Rat did not come back too soon, of clearing his own name and bringing to justice the hellhounds who had struck down that gentle, gray-haired man who had been his friend. His hands clenched harder until, as they had done once before that night, the nails bit into the palms. He, Billy Kane, the murderer of his father's friend, the murderer of the man who had trusted him and loved him. It was getting him now with all its brutal and remorseless force. Broadcast over the country, by morning his name would have become the synonym of all that was vile and hideous, and Billy Kane would be known as one of the most revolting characters in the annals of crime, a foul and filthy thing who typified the dregs and lees of human degradation, a thing from whom the friends of old would turn in horror and in shame, and... Slowly his hands unclenched. The surge of fury that had been almost ungovernable passed, and he knew again that cold, unnatural, deadly calm. If he lived, the guilty man or men would pay. If he were taking a chance now, a desperate chance, he was taking a chance that no man could do otherwise than take. It was the chance to live, for one might better otherwise be dead. A chance! He had picked up Whitie Jack's revolver and was twisting it in his fingers, and now he thrust it suddenly into his pocket. A chance! He was taking no chance indeed, save with the stake that was already flung upon the table, his life. It was the one way. As the Rat, doubtless well known to the authorities, he could move under the very noses of the police at will without suspicion arising that he was Billy Kane, and as the Rat, if Whitie Jack was to be relied upon as a criterion, he would have the run of the underworld, and in the underworld were many secrets, and among those secrets was perhaps the one he sought, the clue to Jackson's associates in the murder of David Ellsworth. He was not blinded to the difficulties of this picking up of the thread of another man's life, nor blinded to what was perhaps the greatest difficulty of all, the necessity of being able to recognize those with whom he should be acquainted, but even that was not insurmountable. He could see a way, he believed, to accomplish even that. But all this was for tomorrow, and the tomorrows after that. Tonight he was going out again, to Marco's. That was why he had changed his clothes just now. A graver thing, the thought of merging his identity with the Rat's, had impinged, obtruded itself, as it were, upon his mind, but he had not forgotten Marco's. He picked up his discarded vest, transferred the package of banknotes and his watch to the pockets of the one he now wore, and as he did so, he looked at the time. Laverto had said 11:15. It was almost that now. Billy Kane's eyes strayed over the table and fell upon the black mask. The mask, too, went into his pocket. It might prove a most valuable discovery, that mask. Under certain circumstances, even the Rat's identity was not lightly to be disclosed. He collected the muddy garments he had taken off and tucked them under the mattress on the bed. It was not likely that anyone would come here, much less attempt to enter in his absence, but he was fully aware that now, and from now on, his life depended upon his caution in every detail. He extinguished the light, put on his hat, walked to the door, unlocked it, and stood for a moment hesitant. Was he a fool to take this added risk, when already his own back was against the wall, when already he was in desperate case himself? He shook his head in a sort of exasperated remonstrance with himself for even his momentary hesitation. Then, opening the door, he locked it behind him and crept cautiously up the stairs to the street. Whitie Jack had only been a tool used for the stage setting of some deviltry that was to follow, at 11:15. That was obvious. He, Billy Kane, had intended that the police should be informed and should deal with Laverto, and that he in person should give evidence against Laverto. But he could no longer inform the police, no longer give evidence. He was wanted now himself for murder. And so upon him fell the moral obligation to prevent, or render abortive, if he could, a crime that he knew was pending. And besides, his face hardened suddenly, as he moved swiftly along, evading the direct rays of the street lights, and keeping in the shadows. He had a personal account to settle with Antonio Laverto. If it had not been for the man's damnable imposition having succeeded to the extent that it had, he, Billy Kane, would not have left the Ellsworth house tonight, and David Ellsworth would not now. Billy Kane's hand in his pocket tightened over the butt of Whitie Jack's revolver. Unconsciously, he quickened his stride. Always hugging the shadows, his hat drawn far down over his face, giving the passer-bys he met as wide a berth as possible, Billy Kane covered the short distance that separated the Rat's den from Marco's. He slipped into the lane unobserved, and for the second time that night crouched against the door with the broken lock. But now, mindful of the door's tendency to squeak, he pushed it open cautiously, an inch at a time. And then, with the door slightly open, he stood motionless, a puzzled and amazed expression on his face. Just exactly what he had expected to find here he was not prepared to say, but certainly not this. A faint light came through from the door of the back room into the hallway, and from the room there came a woman's voice that mingled a sort of pitiful defiance with a sob.
"It's not true! I tell you it's not true! The boy never did it!"
So! It was a man's voice now, caustic and unrelenting. Well, where is he now, then?
"I don't know," the woman replied. "I haven't seen him since supper. But that's got nothing to do with it. That doesn't prove anything."
So! It was the man again. Well, maybe not. But I am not to be fooled. I am a poor man. I cannot afford to lose my money. So it has nothing to do with it, eh? You say that because you are his mother, eh? But did he tell you at supper that I had discharged him this afternoon, eh? Answer me that.
"No."
The answer seemed to come reluctantly. Billy Kane pushed the outer door a little wider open and slipped through. Keeping close to the wall, he edged forward until he could see into the back room through its open door. A frown came and knitted his brows in hard furrows. He was frankly puzzled now. The woman, a tall, powerful, muscular woman of middle age, but curiously frail now in obvious fear and emotion, was Mrs. Clancy, who kept the little notion shop next door on the corner; and the other, bent-shouldered, in long, greasy black coat, with long, untrimmed and dirty white beard, whose eyes were distorted behind the heavy lenses of his steel-bowed spectacles, was Marco, the proprietor of the second-hand store. Marco was apparently in a state of equal distress and excitement. He alternatively wrung his hands together and gesticulated furiously.
$800! He cried out wildly. Do you hear, you, the mother of that brat? $800! All I have on earth! And it is gone, stolen by that cursed young prison bird of yours. So he did not tell you, that I discharged him this afternoon because I was sure he was making little stealings from me all the time. But you are not surprised, Maybe he has stolen from you too,
The woman did not answer. She seemed to shiver suddenly, and then sank down heavily in the chair before the table near which she had been standing. Marco paced up and down the room, back and forth from the table to where the floor was littered with the erstwhile contents of the rifled safe. Billy Kane's puzzled frown grew deeper. Evidently there had been money in the safe, but in some way Laverto had got it before he had set Whitie Jack to work upon a stall, and it was obvious that Laverto had maneuvered to plant the crime on the shoulders of this woman's son. But what, then, had been Laverto's object in bringing Whitie Jack into it at all? It did not seem to fit, or dovetail, or appear logical, And then, with a sudden start, Billy Kane leaned tensely forward, his eyes fixed narrowly on Marco. Yes, it did dovetail. He had it now, all of it. All of the damnable, unscrupulous ingenuity of the plot that had been hatched in Laverto's cunning brain. The frown was hidden now by the mask, which Billy Kane slipped quickly over his face, but his lips, just showing beneath the edge of the mask, were tight and hard.
I was a fool! A fool! Marco cried out sharply. A fool ever to have taken him in here as my clerk. I might have known it. He's already been in jail. It was only the reform school. Mrs. Clancy was wringing her hands piteously. He was only a boy, only 17 now, and he did not mean any harm even then, and since then he has been a good boy. Has he? Marco flung out a clenched fist and shook it in the air. He has, huh? Well then, where did he get this? Answer me that. Where did he get this? Marco's closed hand opened, and he threw what looked to Billy Kane like a little brooch, a miniature in a cheap setting, upon the table. That's you, ain't it? That's his mother's picture, ain't it? Do you think I do not recognize it? That's you, 20 years ago, huh? Did you give it to him, huh? Answer me that. Did you give it to him? The woman had risen from her chair and was swaying upon her feet. Did you think I did not have reason to be pretty sure when I asked if he had not stolen from you, too? Marco, apparently beside himself with rage, was gesticulating furiously again. And you said I had no proof of this, huh? He shook his fist in the direction of the safe. Well, I found that brooch there on the floor where he must have dropped it out of his pocket when he blew my safe open. And he didn't know he dropped it in the dark, and then some of the papers he pulled out covered it. That's where I found it, under the papers. That's proof enough, ain't it? I guess with his record it'll satisfy the police, no matter what his mother thinks. A great sob came from the woman. The tears were rolling down her cheeks. My boy, she faltered. It's true. I am afraid it's true. Oh, my boy, my fatherless boy. She thrust out her hands in a sudden imploring gesture toward the other. Listen, I will tell you all I know. I will show you that I am honest with you, and you will have mercy on us. Tonight, after supper, I found that the little chamois bag in which I keep the few little things I have, like that brooch and the money I take in from the store during the day, was gone. Yes, I was afraid then. I was afraid. But he is all I have, and my $800 that he came over here and stole afterwards was all I had, screamed Marco. You tell me only what a blind man could see for himself. Did I not put 2 and 2 together myself? He has run away now, huh? With all he could get. That he stole from you does not give me my money back. But the police will find him. Ha! Ha! The police will find him. And when they do, they will remember the reform school, and he will get 10 years. Yes, 10 years for this. Listen. Mrs. Clancy's voice choked. She brushed the tears from her cheeks with a trembling hand. If I give you back the money, will you let it go? Ha! Marco stood stock still, staring at her. What is that you say? You will give me back the money? You? Are you trying to make a fool of me? No, no, she cried. I've got that much. It is my savings. It is in the bank. Listen. Oh, for God's sake, be merciful. Give him a chance. You'll get your money back. You won't lose anything, and you would the other way, because before they caught him, he would perhaps have spent a lot of it. That is true, said Marco in a milder tone, and then a hint of suspicion in his voice. What bank is it in? The bank down the street? Yes, she answered. That is my bank too, said Marco. He stared at the woman for a moment speculatively. Then his eyes circled the room, and he stared at the broken safe. Will you pay for my safe? He demanded abruptly. Yes, she agreed eagerly. $50, said Marco. It would be $50. Oh, yes, oh, thank God. She was crying again. So, Marco shrugged his shoulders. Well, I will do it. He walked back toward the safe, picked up a checkbook from amongst the debris on the floor, tore out a blank check, dropped the book on the floor again, and returned to the table. He pushed the slip of paper toward Mrs. Clancy, and pulled out a fountain pen from his pocket. So, well, make out a check for $850. He shrugged his shoulders again. It was slow work. Mrs. Clancy's hand trembled, and she stopped at intervals to wipe her eyes. Billy Kane edged closer to the door. It was probably all she had, the savings of years from the little shop, but the fear and strain was gone from her face, and her lips were quivering in a smile, as she signed her name at last, and handed the check to Marco. But now Billy Kane's revolver was in his hand, and suddenly, as Marco held the check close to his eyes to peer at it through his thick lenses, Billy Kane stepped forward across the threshold, and then Billy Kane spoke. "Drop that, Marco," he said quietly. There was a cry of terror from the woman as she whirled around, white-faced, clutching at her breast. It was echoed by a frightened gasp from Marco, and as though the slip of paper in his fingers had suddenly turned to white-hot iron, he snatched his hands back in a sort of grotesque jerk, and the check fluttered to the table. Billy Kane stepped toward the man. "You've made a mistake, Marco, haven't you?" he inquired coolly. "Instead of this woman's son being the robber, are you sure it isn't yourself?" The man shrank back. What do you mean, myself?" he stammered hoarsely, and then, recovering a little of his self-control, Who are you, and what are you butting in here for? What's your game to say I did that?" He jerked his hand toward the safe. "You can't bluff old Marco, whatever you're up to. I was in Morgenfeldt's cafe all evening until 10:30, and I can prove it, and then 10 minutes after that I was pulling her," he jerked his hand toward Mrs. Clancy now, "out of her shop next door to show her what I had found here. She'll tell you, too. I couldn't have come all the way from Morgenfeldt's and done all that and blown that safe open in 10 minutes, could I?" Billy Kane's smile was unpleasant. "Don't be in such a hurry to produce your alibi, Marco," he said evenly. "It sounds suspicious, and it also accounts for a good deal. I think we'll take a look through your pockets, Marco. Not for the 800." Billy Kane's smile had grown still more uninviting. "But on the chance that we may find something else. Put your hands up." The man hesitated. Billy Kane's revolver muzzle came to a level with the other's eyes. "Put them up," he ordered curtly. And as the man obeyed now, he felt deftly over the other's clothing, located a revolver, whipped it out, and laid it on the table behind him. A moment later, also from the man's pocket, he took a chamois bag, which, too, he placed upon the table. Mrs. Clancy, with a startled cry, snatched at it. "Mary, Mother of Mercy, what does this mean?" she gasped out. "Wait, it's my bag." "It means that our friend Marco here is a very versatile rogue," said Billy Kane grimly. "You may put your hands down now, Marco, and," he was clipping off his words, "you won't need that beard or those glasses any more. Take them off." The man had gone a sudden grayish white.
Mechanically he obeyed, and cowered back, his eyes in terror fixed on Billy Kane's mask. It was Antonio Laverto. With a scream of rage, Mrs. Clancy rushed at the man. "You devil!" she shrilled. "You made me believe my boy was a thief. God forgive me for it! And let me at him. I'm only a woman, but—" Billy Kane had stepped between them.
"Wait!" he said. "There's a better way, Mrs. Clancy." He swung on the Italian. "If it hadn't been for your voice, Laverto, you see, I know you. You might have got away with it. I didn't recognize you at first. You're clever. Damnably clever. I'll give you credit for that if it's any satisfaction to you. You must be a busy man. Are there any more roles in your repertoire? Well, no matter. The Italian crippled beggar and Marco the second-hand clothing dealer are enough for now, and enough to put you where you belong." His voice rasped suddenly. "You blotch on God's earth," he said between his teeth. "You knew Mrs. Clancy had a little money, and you knew that her son had a reform school record against him, and so about 2 weeks ago you rented this place next to hers that was then vacant, and you stocked it with a few old clothes, and you hired her son to act as clerk, and you hired him not with an idea of doing any business, but as a necessary part of your plan to incriminate him in his mother's eyes, and also to enable you, without arousing suspicion by appearing to neglect business here, to attend to other irons equally as despicable that you had in the fire at the time. Playing the flopper, for instance, up on Fifth Avenue. The whole outlay probably cost you but a few dollars, and in return you meant to get all this woman's life savings. I say all because you probably found out how much she had, and if she had had much more than $800, you would have set your fake loss higher. And tonight, in some way, the details do not matter at this moment, you stole from her that chamois bag, both to impress her with the belief that the boy had stolen from her too, and also to secure spurious evidence to prove that he had been guilty of what you claimed had happened here."
Billy Kane paused. His eyes had traveled to the wrecked safe, and sharp and quick had come the thought of Whitie Jack. He smiled grimly. He did not want Whitie Jack to appear in this. He owed Whitie Jack a good deal tonight, and the Rat never forgot. His eyes came back to Marco. The man was circling his lips with the tip of his tongue.
"You're going up for this, Marco," Billy Kane said in level tones, "but I'll give you a friendly tip, for reasons of my own. Maybe you didn't pull this safe-cracking game yourself. Maybe your alibi stands on that count. But if it does, you've got some tool to pull it off for you just for that reason, and possibly also because you didn't know how to handle the soup yourself. And if it's one of the boys, it won't help your case any to snitch on him, for you're caught open and shut in this anyhow. And maybe, Laverto, some of his friends might remember it when you got out again. You get the idea, don't you? Yes, I see you do. Well, then, there's just one thing more. If this little game of yours had broken right for you, Mrs. Clancy's son, to make it appear that he had run away, would have to have had to disappear for several days, until you could have pulled up stakes here without exciting suspicion, and have pretended to move away. Therefore, where is he now, Laverto?"
There were beads of sweat on the man's forehead. His lips moved mumblingly.
"Where?"
Billy Kane's revolver edged viciously forward.
"I didn't hear you."
"Wong Yen's," the man whispered. Billy Kane's jaws snapped together. He had heard of Wong Yen's. It was one of the most infamous Chinese underground dives in the Bad Lands. "Doped?" He bit off the word. "Yes," the man whispered again. Billy Kane turned to Mrs. Clancy.
"He's yours now, Mrs. Clancy. You know the story, and you know where to send them for your boy. I guess I can leave him to you. They say the female of the species is more deadly than the male. There's his revolver. Do you think you could march him out of the front door and hand him over to the first officer you see?"
There was a bitter, hard look on Mrs. Clancy's face. Big and brawny, she towered over the cringing figure of the Italian, and the Italian shrank still farther away from her as she snatched up the weapon.
I can,"
she said, and her short laugh was not a pleasant one.
"Ha! And I can shoot if I have to. And faith, there'd be joy in the doing of it. But you—"
Her voice broke suddenly.
I don't know who you are, and I owe you."
Billy Kane was backing toward the back door. "You'll pay it all, and more, Mrs. Clancy, when you hand him over to the police," he said quickly, and stepping out into the passageway, he ran down its length, whipping the mask from his face as he went, and in another instant from the lane had gained the cross street. Chapter 6 of Doors of the Night by Frank L. Packard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. A Midnight Visitor. Keeping in the shadows and avoiding the passers-by as on his way to Marco's, Billy Kane hurried even more now on his return to the Rats. In a moment or so, when Mrs. Clancy reached the front street with her prisoner, there was likely to be an uproar, and he wanted to be housed and under cover, if possible, before that broke loose. Mrs. Clancy's story could hardly omit reference to the man in the mask, and the police, to say nothing of the onlookers, might evince a most unpleasant degree of practical curiosity. And he, Billy Kane, was in no condition, either mental or above all physical, to play hare to the hounds of the law again that night. He was conscious now, as he made his way swiftly along, that his shoulder was paining him intensely again, and that, though through nerve force his feet moved quickly enough under him, his knees were wobbly and weak. He turned a corner, and still another, and drew a deep breath of relief. He was out of range of the second-hand shop now, and the Rat's den was just ahead up the street, and there was no one in sight. Billy Kane swept his hand heavily across his eyes. It was strange. There was not far from being a very close analogy between himself and Mrs. Clancy's son tonight. Mrs. Clancy's son had been selected as the victim of a plant, much like himself, only there had been no murder, and the plant had failed. It was curious, very curious, that the two should have been so much alike, and that though he had been able to save the other, he himself was being searched for at that moment in every corner of New York, and that the human dragnet was spread for him, and that the wires all over the country were hot with his description, and that into every newspaper office in every state was pouring the story that would make of him an abominable and abandoned thing. His head was singing. He stumbled a little as he made his way down the stairs and fumbled with Whitie Jack's key in the lock of the Rat's door. Well, if the Rat, who was away, did not return too soon, and if— He shook his head as he opened the door and stepped inside and locked it behind him. No, he was too tired, too near the breaking point to think any more. He had a chance to rest now until morning. Whitie Jack had said that no one would dare disturb the Rat, and that was enough. He did not want to think any more until morning. He groped his way forward to the electric light, reached up to turn it on, and with his arm poised in midair stood suddenly tense and rigid. He listened. It came again, as though someone were knocking cautiously on the wall, and it seemed to come from the far end of the room near the bureau. Billy Kane's hand shot into his pocket and closed on his revolver, and, quick and silent in every movement now, he tiptoed across the room in the darkness, slipped in behind the cretonne hanging, and waited, peering through a corner of the hanging. And now it was absolutely silent again. Perhaps a half-minute passed, and then, grotesquely, as though it came through the wall itself, the white ray of a flashlight streamed into the room, and circled it slowly and deliberately. And then a form moved forward, a woman's form, and crossed the room to the table. There was a slight sound as of the rustling of paper, and with the ray now flooding the top of the table, Billy Kane could see that she was writing. But her back was turned, and he could not see her face. For a moment more she stood there, bending over the table, and then turning, she retreated again to the rear of the room. The flashlight now was full on the rear wall, but there was no opening there. Billy Kane leaned tensely forward, watching through the corner of the hanging. This den of the Rats that he, or fate for him, had appropriated, promised much more than appeared on the surface. It was obvious that there was another entrance than that from the street, and to obtain its secret now was a matter upon which his life, sooner or later, might very easily depend. She was stooping now, slightly, and her hand in the glare of the flashlight was moving in a slow, tentative way up and down one of the wall boards. And then her hand for an instant remained motionless. Billy Kane drew in his breath softly. It was ingenious, clever, cunning, and a craftsman's work. A small door swung open into the room, a most curious door. Its top was of an absurd zigzag shape, due to the fact that it followed the natural joints of the wall boards, and the whole, 3 boards in width, in no part, therefore, to casual or even critical examination, would show any signs of an opening, since it opened only where boards joined one another, and since everywhere in the room all the wall boards were more or less warped and ill-fitting. The light was suddenly shaded, obliterated almost, as she passed through the opening, and then was blotted out. The door had closed without a sound. She was gone. Billy Kane did not move. His eyes, as though fascinated, as though fearful that he might lose it, were fixed through the darkness on the particular spot on the wall where this strange midnight visitor had run her hand up and down. A minute, 2, 3 passed. Wherever that opening led to, she must be far enough away now to make it safe for him to act. But he dared not turn on the electric light. It might throw a glimmer to the street. He was none too sure of either the sill or panels of that front door. Whitie Jack had passed the word around of the Rat's return. Was this woman one to whom that word had come? In any case, she had thought the room empty, the Rat away, and therefore he could not run the risk of exposing the fact that he had been hidden there. He knew too little, and perhaps already too much. He stepped silently over to the wall now. If he only had a match, but he had lost his match safe with his coat. No, there were matches here, a box of them. His fingers had been mechanically searching his pockets. He had forgotten. It was not even the coat Whitie Jack had given him at the second-hand shop. It was the Rat's coat now he was wearing. He struck a match, located the board, pressed his hand up and down its length, and felt something give slightly. The door began to swing open. He blew out the match instantly, and crouched there, listening. He could hear nothing. He lighted another match, and this time held it above his head. A short, tunnel-like passage through the ground, strongly braced and stayed, and tending generally upward, confronted him. He stepped forward into the opening, and, bending head and shoulders, for the roof was scarcely 4 feet in height, followed the passage for some 5 or 6 yards to where it ended abruptly in a blank wall of earth, but where, above his head, a third match disclosed a trap door. Again Billy Kane listened, and then cautiously raised the door. It was pitch black now. He drew himself up, and once more listened. There was no sound. He lighted another match, the stub of the one before being carefully consigned to his pocket, and nodded his head in understanding. The passage had led him into a shed, evidently little used, for it was littered and stored with odds and ends that, judging from the accumulated dust and dirt, had been untouched for a long time. And the shed itself, yes, he was right, he had pushed the back door open a little. The shed gave directly on a lane. Billy Kane closed the shed door, and, noting with grim appreciation that the trapdoor, as he closed it above his head, was an ingenious arrangement of the floor planking similar to the construction of the door within the Rat's quarters, and was moreover, as an added precaution, surrounded by an apparently careless stowage of the shed's litter, he made his way back along the passage again. The room door he examined as he passed through. It was manipulated from the inside of the passage by an ordinary and frankly obvious spring lock. He closed it, and stood for a moment staring at it speculatively. There seemed to be no way of locking it here in the room, of protecting himself from an intrusion through the night that might not be either as instructive or as harmless as this first one had been. There might be a way, and there probably was a way of fastening it. The Rat would surely have seen to that. But he, Billy Kane, was too far gone now, too weak, too tired, too nearly all in to hunt or search for it now. And there was a way of obviating the possibility of the door being opened without first arousing him and putting him on his guard. He went to the table, picked up a chair, and carrying it back, tilted it against the door in the wall. And now he swayed a little, and his hand sought his eyes. He was conscious again of his aching shoulder, and that his head was swimming dizzily. But he seemed to have forgotten something. Yes, he remembered now. That paper on which she had written something. He laughed in a strained, almost delirious way. He must be worse than he imagined if he had even for an instant forgotten that. Or was it just simply the reaction coming now? He stumbled toward the table, and, feeling with his hand, secured the paper. But there was no chair here now, and he stumbled across the room and sat down on the edge of the bed. He lighted another match, held it close to the paper, and read the penciled lines. "So you are back, are you? Well, so am I. Remember." The match burned down to his fingers, and he dropped it on the floor. What did it mean? Who was she? He shook his head. And then, with a queer, twisted smile, he folded the paper, thrust it into his pocket, and, stretching himself out fully dressed upon the bed, lay there staring into the darkness. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Doors of the Night by Frank L. Packard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. Whispering Shadows. It was the next evening in the Rat's den. Through half-closed eyes, as he lay stretched out on the bed, Billy Kane watched Whitie Jack across the room. The man was tilted back in his chair, his legs were sprawled across the table, and from his cigarette, which dangled from one corner of his lower lip, a thread of blue smoke spiraled lazily upward. Whitie Jack was not smoking. The cigarette simply hung forgotten on the man's lip. For the moment, Whitie Jack, with bated interest, was poring over the evening paper. And then Whitie Jack looked up suddenly and spoke, out of the unoccupied corner of his mouth. "Say, that secretary guy that croaked the old geezer last night was a sweet downy bird, isn't it? But believe me, he made some haul. Some haul." Billy Kane made no reply. Whitie Jack resumed his absorbing perusal of the newspaper. Billy Kane's eyes closed completely, but not in sleep. It had been a day that, viewed in retrospect, made the brain whirl. It had been a wild, untrammeled phantasmagoria. That was it, phantasmagoria. There was no other word. The day was expressed in shadows, moving shadows, shadows that came and went, many of them shadows that were paradoxically real and concrete, and shadows that were the reflection of things felt and sensed, but unseen. And these latter, the shadows of the mind, were weird, uncanny things like denizens out of some black world apart, ghoulish things. And the shadows that were real and concrete, that spoke and whispered, seemed to take it for granted that he was and always had been in their evil confidence. And so their words were not rounded out, and there was only the hint of dark and hideous things in which he was supposed to have a part. It had been a day of mutterings, of whisperings, of skulking things that had fled the sunlight. The brain and mind was in riot from it. It was evening now. It had been the strangest day through which any man had ever lived. He had held court that morning and through the day, here in the Rat's lair, a sort of grim, unholy court to which grim, unholy courtiers had flocked to pay him homage. And these courtiers had been admitted to the presence, one by one, their names announced by Whitie Jack, who had acted quite innocently, quite free from any thought of connivance, as the master of ceremonies. Billy Kane's lips twisted in a mirthless smile. It had been very simple, that part of it, much more simple than he had dared to hope it would be. Bundy Morgan, alias the Rat, was supposed to know all those who composed the elite of the underworld intimately and well, but Billy Kane, upon whom fate had thrust for the moment the personality and entity of Bundy Morgan, alias the Rat, knew none of them, and yet it had been simple. So simple that against the peril, the certain death that would follow fast on the heels of even a misplaced word or an unguarded look, it had been even grotesquely absurd in its simplicity. Through the dens and dives of the Bad Lands, spread by Whitie Jack when he had gone away the night before, the whisper had passed that the Rat had returned, and so throughout the day stealthy footsteps had descended from the street to the basement door here, and in response to the knock Whitie Jack had opened the door a cautious inch, peering out, and then he, Billy Kane, from the bed, his voice querulous for the occasion, had demanded who it was, and Whitie Jack had answered, and the unsuspected introduction thus performed, he had bidden Whitie Jack admit the visitor. There had been many like that, very many, and he had learned many things. His hands clenched suddenly at his sides. The role he played promised well. Innuendos, words toying with the fringe of things, had made it only too glaringly clear that the Rat was enmeshed in devilishness that ran the gamut of every crime in the Decalogue. And for the moment he was the Rat. There was some hell's syndicate, whose scope and power he could only dimly plumb, though he was satisfied that its branches were rooted in every nook and corner of the underworld. And of this syndicate he was now, by proxy, a member. And he was not only a member, but he was one of those magnates of crime who composed its inner council, its unhallowed directorate. He twisted a little on the bed, more in mental than in physical unrest. His wounded shoulder was still far from healed, of course, but it gave him very little discomfort, and in no way interfered with his freedom of action. But it had been the safer way, this accentuating of his hurt, this pretended state of semi-helplessness. It had brought those he must know here to him. It had brought about those unsuspected introductions, without which, had he first left this lair of the Rat's and attempted, trusting to luck, to pick up the threads of the Rat's life, would inevitably have plunged him in his blind groping to certain destruction. Also, it had brought him a quite thorough understanding of Whitie Jack, the man's deference that had been almost cringing at their first meeting, and then the man's subsequent eagerness to serve. Whitie Jack was one of the lesser breed that looked up to the heights the Rat had attained with both awe and unbounded admiration. The man had come like a dog to heel, but like a faithful dog. Whitie Jack was living in a sort of reflected glory. He would be the envy of the proletariat of the Bad Lands. He was associating now, was even on terms of certain intimacy, with one of those in high places in that inglorious commonwealth of crime, to which both by birth and inclination he owed allegiance. It opened a new prospect to Whitie Jack, one that was full of dazzling possibilities, and it had made of the man an invaluable ally. Whitie Jack had been at once valet, nurse, surgeon, and attendant all through the day. He had returned at daylight that morning, dressed the wound, and thereafter had not left the place except to go out and buy certain necessities, such as food, and a pocket flashlight, which Billy Kane, mindful of his previous night's experience in the underground passage to the shed and lane, had ranked amongst those necessities as the first on the list. Billy Kane shifted his position restlessly on the bed again. His mind was in a turmoil of feverish activity. It seemed as though 1,000 divergent thoughts fought with each other to obtain undivided attention and recognition, each for itself, and the battle went on incessantly. Who was the woman who had crept in here in the darkness through the secret door last night? What did it mean, that message she had written and left on the table? So you are back, are you? Well, so am I, remember. There was something malignant, Something ominous in that word, remember. Remember what? Why? What sinister thing was it that lay between her and the Rat, that he, Billy Kane, must now accept and stand sponsor for, since he was now the Rat? The Rat, the Rat, the Rat. His brain was off again at another tangent. In heaven's name, who was the Rat? Where was the Rat at this moment? When would the Rat return? Guarded questions all through the day helped him little. The Rat's absence had been accepted, that was all. None seemed to know or have any interest in the cause of it. One ray of reassurance only had filtered through the murk. The Rat's return in his, Billy Kane's person, had seemingly been premature. The Rat had seemingly not been expected, and he could argue from that, and with fair logic, that he might for a little while at least be left undisturbed in his possession of the Rat's personality and the Rat's belongings, as far as the Rat was concerned. The Rat. Those innuendos, those whispers, those shadows, that strange woman's stranger message were back again, seething and boiling in his brain. Naked ugliness. What mess of iniquity was the Rat not mixed up in? And what mess of iniquity might not he, Billy Kane, accepted without question as the Rat, now, with the Rat's face and features, with the Rat's satanic partnerships, be forced to wallow in to save his life, and more than life to— The paper rustled in Whitie Jack's hand. "Some haul." Whitie Jack rolled the words on his tongue like some sweet morsel. "Sell me $500,000 worth of rubies. That guy Kane is some slick gazabo. Say, just get it, Bundy. 500,000 and a bunch of the green stuff too." He licked his lips. "Some haul." The paper had exaggerated. David Ellsworth's rubies at the outside would not exceed $300,000 in value. Billy Kane found himself curiously and querulously irritated at the inaccuracy. He opened his eyes, nodded unconcernedly at Whitie Jack, and closed his eyes again. His mind was suddenly alert and concentrated. In a few minutes now, some of those who composed that inner council of crime would be here. He had arranged that this morning with Red Vallon. Red Vallon was the biggest gangster in New York. Whitie Jack had dropped that information in an enthusiastic eulogy of Red Vallon, and Vallon had bent over the bed that morning and whispered of a meeting tonight at the usual time and place. But he, Billy Kane, was not ready for that yet. He knew too little, it was too great a risk, and he knew too much to escape alive if a chance word or act betrayed him. But there had come a thought, swift, in a blinding flash, a staggering thing, a gambler's stake, and he had whispered back what was apparently the obvious reply, that he was too badly hurt to go. And then— "One or two of you slip in here on your way over," he had said quickly. "Get me? I've got something." And Red Vallon had agreed, and with Red Vallon would come Karlin. Karlin. The name had somehow seemed familiar, but though Whitie Jack had subsequently furnished a partial clue by referring to Karlin as one of the highbrow lawyers of the city, he could not definitely place the man. Billy Kane turned on his side with his face away from Whitie Jack. Red Vallon and Karlin would be here in a few moments, and he must make no mistake now. What he meant to do was an impudent thing, impudent with a titanic impudence. He meant to pit the underworld in a fight on the side of justice against the police. He meant to use the craft, the cunning, and the stealth of the Badlands to establish his innocence. He too had read the papers, the morning and evening papers, and the headlines had shrieked out at him the infamy of which he was accused. His name was a byword now from one end of the country to the other. A viper and a degraded wretch, a thing inhuman and apart, the papers had called him. He had read them all to the last word. Murderer of his benefactor. A thief, an assassin thief who had fled for his life with those blood-red rubies. A bead of sweat came out on his forehead, and he raised his hand and brushed it away. Yes, he had fled. To flight,
to take the only chance he had of bringing to justice the hellhounds who had struck down his old friend, the only chance he had of clearing his own name. Well, he would fight. It was beginning now, that fight, but he was between two fires that threatened him at any instant with destruction. The police, not only in New York, but from the Atlantic to the Pacific, would search ceaselessly for him, and if he were caught, it was death. Fate, that had made him the double of a character that ironically seemed to measure up to everything the papers had said about himself, had thrown in that way a temporary mantle of protection over him, but let that mantle slip but ever so slightly, and he would better 1,000 times hand himself over to the law and have done with it. The end would be more merciful. But fate, too, had given him a weapon with which to fight, and two-edged though it was, with a chance always that it might turn upon himself, he meant to use it now, and that weapon was the underworld. He did not know yet, he was not sure yet just how high he stood in that unsavory command, but he had discounted rather than overrated his power, and he believed he had power enough for his purpose. Those whispers and those shadows had seemed to assure him of that. The Rat seemed to be the driving strategical force in this crime syndicate that appeared to permeate the Badlands with its influence, and move and sway the underworld at its own imperious pleasure. And for the moment he was the Rat. There was Jackson, and Jackson was dead. His mind had flown off at another apparently irrelevant tangent, but it was not irrelevant. The papers had said that Jackson, the footman, had died that morning after lingering in a semi-conscious state throughout the night. Jackson was the single clue in his possession. Jackson, he knew, was one of the murderers, but Jackson was the only man who knew who was concerned in that devil's work last night, and Jackson was dead. And now he, Billy Kane, was wanted on a double charge of murder, for the murder of Jackson, who had probably himself struck old David Ellsworth down, as well as for the murder of the old millionaire. Yet Jackson, even if dead, must still have left some clue behind him, if only that clue could be found. Who was Jackson? The man had already been in service at David Ellsworth before he, Billy Kane, had gone there as the old philanthropist's secretary, and he had naturally had neither motive nor interest in any of the footman's personal concerns. But those facts were vital now. Who was Jackson? Where had the man come from? Who were... Steps were descending from the street. There was a low knock, twice repeated on the door. Whitie Jack was on his feet, and looked inquiringly toward the bed. "Watch yourself," said Billy Kane gruffly. "I'm not entertaining tonight, except—" "Sure, I know," said Whitie Jack. He crossed the room, and opening the door a crack, peered out. "Red and Carlin," he informed Billy Kane in a whisper. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Doors of the Night by Frank L. Packard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8. A Leash is Slipped. Billy Kane lighted a cigarette. Red Vallon he already knew. Carlin he was supposed to know. "Let them in," instructed Billy Kane. He raised himself on his elbow. "Hello, Carlin," he greeted as the two men stepped into the room. "Red's told you I was laid up, huh? Glad to see you. Shake." His eyes, half closed, fixed on the other in scrutiny as the man advanced toward the bed. Carlin was immaculately dressed, in sharp contrast to the untidy and careless attire of the stocky, brutal-faced gangster who followed close at his heels. The man was tall, slimly built, and, save that the black eyes were too close together and too small, had a pleasant and attractive face. It was a mask, perhaps. The smile was too engaging, and it was rather curious how small the ears were, and how tightly they hugged the skull. He toyed with a little black Vandyke beard as he shook hands. "Same to you, Bundy." The voice was soft, silky, persuasive. "Glad you're back, too." He made an almost imperceptible movement with his head toward Whitie Jack, who still remained near the door. Red Vallon was more blunt. "What about him, Bundy?" he growled, and jerked a thumb in Whitie Jack's direction. "We got to mosey along as soon as we can, savvy?"
"Sure," said Billy Kane. "Whitie, you take a holiday for the night. Come back in the morning. Beat it." The cigarette hanging on Whitie Jack's lip drooped in sudden dejection, but if he swallowed hard to choke back what was evidently a very grievous disappointment, he made no demur.
"All right, Bundy, if you say so,"
he blurted out, and went from the room, closing the door behind him. The man's footfalls mounting the cellar-like stairs to the street died away, and for a moment there was no sound except for a faint, irregular tapping from the floor above. "What's that?" demanded Karlin sharply. Billy Kane blew a ring of smoke ceilingward, and lazily watched it dissolve into air. Whitie Jack, through judicious prodding, had served him well that day. "Old Ignatz. Keeps the cobbler's shop above. Half blind and has to work overtime. Wife's nearly 70 and deaf." Billy Kane was explaining almost wearily. "What do you think I hang on to this hole for?"
"Sure," grunted Red Vallon corroboratingly. "But Karlin's never been here before."
He pushed a chair with the toe of his boot across the floor toward Karlin, and appropriated one beside the table for himself.
"Well, spill it, Bundy," he invited. "We got to hurry. It's too bad you're laid up and can't sit in on the showdown, but Merxler's plums got ripe, and we got to pick it tonight, savvy?"
Billy Kane duplicated the first smoke ring. Merxler. He had identified Karlin now. Karlin and Merxler. That was where he had heard Karlin's name, in connection with Merxler, and it must necessarily then be the same Merxler. Was young Merxler, whom he had heard of and had even met through David Ellsworth, more then than simply the notorious spendthrift that he was credited with being? Karlin, it was obvious, was leading a double life. Was Merxler another of the inner circle, another from the higher ranks of society, and the greater criminal therefore?
"Piker stuff,"
commented Billy Kane complacently. Karlin leaned forward with a jerk in his chair. "Piker stuff!" he ejaculated, and the little black eyes contracted and fixed on Billy Kane in a puzzled glitter. "Piker stuff!" he echoed challengingly. Billy Kane nodded indifferently. He was skating on thin ice, on perilously thin ice. Whatever the Merxler plum might be, it was obviously far from the definition he had given it, and having apparently displayed an intimacy with the affair, an intimacy that he was evidently supposed to possess, it was decidedly best left alone. "That's what I said," he drawled deliberately. "Piker stuff, compared with what I've got. I told you I had something, Red, didn't I?" Red Vallon hitched sideways in his chair, his head thrust forward. "Go to it, Bundy. Spill it." He circled his lips with his tongue. "If you say so, that goes. What's the lay?" $500,000. A $500,000. Cold. Billy Kane had lowered his voice. He did not look at either of the men, but he was watching them both intently. His eyes were on the mirror of the bureau at the far end of the room, that bore testimony to the cunning of his unwitting host. The mirror held the door and the upper part of the room in focus, and lying there on the bed he had the profiles of the two men in distinct outline. Karlin was fingering his Van Dyke in a sort of hesitant incredulity. Vallon's face had suddenly blotched red with rapacious excitement.
"God!" Red Vallon sputtered out. "Do you mean that, Bundy?"
"Sure, I mean it," Billy Kane answered a little curtly. "What do you think I told you to come in here for? Sure, I mean it. It's all there, right on the table, hitting you between the eyes." Red Vallon jerked himself around, and, as though he had taken the words literally, stared with a frown of bewilderment at the only thing in view on the table, the newspaper that Whitie Jack had dropped there when he had answered the summons at the door. Billy Kane laughed quietly. "Get it, Red?" he inquired. $500,000. Better than diamonds. Blood red rubies. Red with blood, the paper says. Can't you read?" Karlin had forgotten his beard. His hands clenched on his knees. "You mean the Ellsworth murder, the robbery?" he was whispering hoarsely. "You win," said Billy Kane. "My God," whispered Karlin. "Do you know where that stuff is?" Billy Kane's eyes had returned to the mirror, and now suddenly they shifted a little to the wall at the side of the bureau. Something cold and forbidding seemed to grip at him, numbing for an instant mental and physical action, and then left him in a state of grim, unnatural calmness. Was it imagination? He could have sworn that the wall moved slightly. He swung over on his left side as though to face Karlin and Red Vallon more directly before he answered them, but his hand, slipping into his coat pocket, closed over his revolver. It might be imagination, but the possibility remained that someone was on the other side of that secret door, and having pushed the door almost imperceptibly open, was listening there. If that were so, he must get rid of Red Vallon and Karlin before any denouement came, if possible, get rid of them without an instant's loss of time. But equally vital was the necessity of setting in motion, and equally without loss of time, the machinery of the underworld upon which now he was practically staking his all. "Pull your chair over here, closer to the bed, Red. And you too, Karlin," he said coolly. "We aren't likely to be heard from the street, but there's no reason for shouting. No, I don't know where they are. I haven't got the rubies in my pocket, but I know how to get them there. But—" Red Vallon's face was working in a sort of anticipatory and avaricious ugliness. Karlin's expression was scarcely less rapacious. "Go on, Bundy," Karlin said under his breath. "What do you know about it?" "Well, what you could have read for yourself in the paper," Billy Kane answered tersely. "And it looks like a cinch. It's just a case of beating the police to it, and it sizes up as though we had the jump on them." He was speaking almost mechanically. His mind was on that section of the wall that might have moved, and through half-closed eyes, but as though deep in thought and as though concentrated on what he was saying, he was watching it narrowly. It had not moved a second time, of that he was sure. Perhaps it had not moved at all. It might be only nerves on his part, nerves high-strung, taut to the breaking point, but his fingers were still rigid around the stock of his revolver, and in the pocket the weapon, resting on his hip as he lay sideways, held a bead on the panels of the secret door. "I don't quite get you," muttered Karlin with a frown. Red Vallon swore roughly, intolerant in his eagerness. "Oh, give him a chance," he said impatiently. "If he says so, that's good enough for me. Bundy never pulled a steer in his life, and if he says this is a cinch, that goes. Give him a chance." "It's like this," said Billy Kane. "It's 1,000 to 1 shot that this secretary chap who croaked the old millionaire and got away with the goods is still in New York. Why? Well, I'll tell you why. After pulling the murder, according to the papers, he beat it out of the house with the loot, and evidently hid the stuff somewhere. Then he came back to the house again, and the footman, Jackson, grabbed him. But there was a good half hour between the time the police found out about the murder and before this guy Kane came back to the house. Get me? And during that time the police got busy and shot fly cops around all the stations and ferries. It's a cinch, the way I look at it, that after he crawled into that lane and they lost him there, that he's been crawling ever since somewhere around New York. He never left the city. He never had a chance." Red Vallon whistled low and complacently under his breath. Karlin, fingering his Van Dyke again, nodded sharply now in approval. "Besides," added Billy Kane, "he had sort of queered his own game. He'd hidden the loot somewhere, and he couldn't make a direct getaway then. He had to get hold of the goods again before he went. All right. What I want to know is who's got the better chance of grabbing him, us or the police. He isn't one of us. He's working on his own. Well, all right. If we nip him, and he's satisfied with a little rake-off, and is willing to cough up the rest, that'll be treating him fair. If he isn't strong on coughing up, we'll find another way of making him come across that he won't like so well. And we'll get the $500,000, and he'll get—" Billy Kane completed his sentence with a significant shrug of his shoulder. An oath, the more callous and brutal for the soft, purring way in which it fell from his lips, came from Red Vallon. "What do you want done, Bundy?" Karlin was terse and to the point. "It looks good to me, if we can pull it off."
"It's the biggest haul we'll ever get our mitts on if we live 100 years."
Billy Kane's eyes shifted for an instant from the wall to fix themselves impressively on the two men. "I've been lying here all day thinking it out. What do I want done? Well, I'll tell you. I want every string and every wire we've got pulled. Savvy? We've got to beat the police to it. We've got to get Kane first. I want all the boys that the bulls think they've got sewed up as stool pigeons to stool pigeon the police and get all the inside dope. And then that fella Jackson, the footman, looks like a bet we can't throw down. He's dead, but he looks like a good bet. He lived all through the night, but the papers don't say anything about the story he told. Perhaps he knew something that will help, perhaps he didn't. But he doesn't go into the discard yet. Find out who he was and all about him, and get next to his family if he's got one. If he told any story to the police, any of the family that were clustering around the bedside'll be wise to it. Get the idea?" "Birdie Rose is the boy for that." Red Vallon's bullet head was thrust forward in vicious earnestness. His red-rimmed black eyes were glittering with a feverish light.
"Let Birdie go to it, then," said Billy Kane.
"Birdie was slated for the Meixler affair tonight." Karlin spoke a little dubiously.
"Shift him,"
snapped Billy Kane curtly.
"Red's right. Birdie's the boy for this job."
"All right," agreed Karlin, and shrugged his shoulders. He turned to Red Vallon. "Put Bull McCann in Birdie's place, then. See that he gets to Jerry's back room before 10. "I'll fix it," grunted Red Vallon. "What's next, Bundy? This goes? All the boys fall for it?"
"There's only one more thing until something begins to crack open."
Billy Kane's lips had tightened, his eyelids had drooped still lower. It was only a bare fraction of an inch at most, if at all, but it seemed that door had moved again. His words were coming barely above a whisper now.
"There's only one way he can get anything out of those rubies, and that's through a fence. They're no good to him unless he can cash in. He'll try to get rid of some of them as soon as he can. How soon depends on how well he knows his way about. But he's probably slick enough to have got a line on a blind uncle or two. All right, the police, of course, have passed the word down the line. But here's where we put one over on the police. There's some of the joints they don't know. We know them all. Kane might get away from the police there, but he can't get away from us on that deal. I want every fence in New York tipped off that he's to stall on the job the minute he gets his lamps on a ruby that's being shoved his way, and that instead of opening up to the police, he's to wise us up on the hop. That's all for a starter, and now go to it."
Red Vallon drew in his breath noisily, as though he were sucking at some luscious and juicy fruit. "Some head, Bundy!" he applauded with undisguised admiration, as he pushed away his chair and stood up. "Sure, we'll go to it. Karlin's running the Merxler game tonight, and I'll start this other thing bumping along on the high gear. What about the reports? Who's the boys to make 'em to? You, here?" It was a moment before Billy Kane answered. It was the one thing he must have, the one thing upon which he was staking everything, an intimate knowledge of the result of every move made in this game that he had initiated, and beyond that again it was vital that he, and no one else, should control each successive move. But Whitie Jack was gone for the night. In one way he deplored the fact, in another way he was relieved. If it was only imagination, if there was no one crouching there now on the other side of that secret door, Whitie Jack's presence would not matter. But otherwise, his mind leaped to that very point. If Whitie Jack was not here to perform those very necessary introductions, and Red Vallon's messengers came, messengers that he would be supposed to know, but would not be able to recognize, it would spell almost certain disaster. And
"There isn't anything likely to break tonight, Red," he said deliberately. "If there does, you look after it, and if it's anything very important, you come here yourself. I want to get a night's sleep if I can. I'm feeling pretty rocky. But I ought to be on my feet tomorrow, and in the morning you can swing the whole business over to me, and I'll run it."
"Atta boy!" said Red Vallon heartily. "See you in the morning, then." Karlin, too, had risen from his chair. "Good night, Bundy," he said, and grinned. "I pay you the compliment of being the trickiest crook unhung." End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Doors of the Night by Frank L. Packard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9. Behind the Door. The door closed behind the two men. Billy Kane lay motionless, save that as they climbed to the street and their footsteps echoed back from the stairs, his hand, gripping his revolver, stole silently from his pocket. There was a grim whiteness around his set lips. His ears strained to hear the slightest sound from within the room, and strained to catch the last echo of those retreating footfalls. He dared not make a move until they were well away, out of earshot, say, of a revolver report. If it were fancy, if the movement of that door were only his imagination, unhealthily stimulated, and unhealthily preying upon his nerves, he would at least put an end to it in short order now. The steps rang faintly back from the pavement, still more faintly, and were lost. And then Billy Kane spoke, a cold, deadly monotony in his voice. "Those boards are thin. Come out into the room with your hands up before I count 3 or I'll put a bullet through. 1, 2. There was a laugh, undisguised in its mockery, but low and musical. The door, bizarre and grotesque in its zigzag projections due to its ingenious adherence to the natural joints in the wall boards, swung open wide, and a woman stood in the room. "I was only waiting for your friends to go, Bundy," she said coolly. The revolver sagged a little bit in Billy Kane's hand. He could not see her face very well. The single incandescent dangling from the ceiling was miserably inadequate, but dark eyes flashed at him out of an oval face, and the chin thrown up gave a glimpse of the contour of a full throat, ivory white, and all this was merged in the background of a slender figure clothed and cloaked in some dark material, unrelieved by a single vestige of color. She spoke again. "I don't think you're quite as badly hurt as you pretend, Bundy," she said, with a sort of icy composure. "You were out last night when I came here, and if you could prowl around the streets, I think perhaps you could manage now to get from the bed over to the door there and back again without doing yourself any serious injury. The door has been unlocked since Red Vallon went out, and it might be safer locked." Billy Kane did not answer her. He got up, crossed to the door, locked it, and returning, sat down on the edge of the bed. She had not moved from her position near the far end of the room. He became conscious that he was still holding his revolver in his hand, and he thrust the weapon quietly now into his pocket. A grim smile came and hovered on his lips. This complication, another of the ramifications of his stolen identity, he did not understand at all, except that it promised him no good. She was the author of last night's note, she had just said as much, and the wording of that note was not reassuring as to her attitude toward him, nor was the mockery in her laugh, nor was the self-contained, almost contemptuous note of command with which she had just spoken. Who was she? What was she to the Rat, that she knew the secret of that underground tunnel, and the secret of that door? He jerked his hand toward the chair Red Vallon had vacated. "Sit down, won't you?" There was a tingle of irony in his voice. His invitation was at least safe ground. She came forward toward the table, a subtle, supple grace in her movements. Subconsciously he noted that she made no sound as she crossed the room. She was like a cat, but a very beautiful cat. He could see her face better now. The eyes were hard and unfriendly, but they were great, brown, steady eyes of unfathomable depths. She leaned against the table. "I prefer to stand." There was a challenge in her tones. "What I have to say will not take long." Billy Kane waited. The initiative was with her. He meant it to remain so. Her small white hand, ungloved, clenched suddenly at her side until its knuckles stood out like little chalky knobs. "You look sleeker about the face, clearer about the eyes, you beast." There was a studied deliberation in her voice that gave the words the sting of a curling whiplash. "Perhaps you've been—" "You were listening there at the door," suggested Billy Kane imperturbably, as he reached into his pocket for a cigarette. There was a mocking little lift to her shoulders. "Of course. That is what I came for. I followed Red Vallon here. I supposed that you would meet at the old place, now that you are back, but since you are an invalid—" Again her shoulders lifted.
"I'm afraid it hardly paid you for the trouble to listen,"
Billy Kane murmured casually.
"I'm sorry. I rather fancied I saw the door move, and you see my illness has affected my voice, and at times I can scarcely speak above a whisper. Otherwise you might have overheard—"
"I overheard enough." She took a sudden step toward him. Her eyes were flashing now. There was a flush, angry red, mounting from the white throat, suffusing her cheeks. She raised her clenched hands. "You will die with insolence and bravado on your lips, I believe," she cried out passionately. "How I hate you! But I've got you, like that." She flung out an arm toward him, and the small clenched hand opened and then closed again slowly, as though in its grip it were remorselessly crushing and exterminating some abhorrent thing. And then her hand was raised again, and was brushed across her eyes, and a little quiver ran through her form, and she spoke more calmly. "I overheard enough. I thought this Merxler affair would be worked to-night, and I came to tell you that you are to stop it. I came to tell you to remember. I promise before God that if there is a murder done to-night, you will be in the hands of the police within an hour, and it's not very far from the Tombs to the death chair in Sing Sing, Bundy Morgan." Billy Kane's eyes were hidden by drooped lids. His eyes were studying with curious abstraction the pattern of the faded, greasy, threadbare strip of carpet on the floor beside the bed. Murder! The word had come with a shock that for a moment unnerved him. He had not associated anything that Red Vallon or Karlin had said with murder. They had spoken so lightly, referred to it in so humdrum a way. Murder! There was something ghastly in that lightness now. A tightness came to his lips, a horror was creeping into his soul. He was only on the verge of things, of hidden and abominable things. Here in this shadow land, this night land of skulking shapes, this sordid realm of the underworld. He pulled himself together. He was the Rat. He had a part to play. He was conscious that those brown, fearless eyes were fixed on him contemptuously.
"What have I to do with it?"
he muttered sullenly. "Do with it? You?" Her voice rose as though suddenly out of control. "You dare ask that? You, with your devil's brains, you who planned it all before you went away!" The cigarette that he had lighted had gone out. He sucked at it, circling it around his lips. He was fencing now with unbuttoned foils.
"Well, you've said it."
There was a snarl creeping into his voice.
"I've been away. I don't know what they've done since I've been away."
"You know about the will, and the sealed envelope in Merxler's safe, and you know the combination to the safe," she said levelly. "And that's all you need to know to stop this from going any further." He laughed out shortly.
"And suppose I don't know the combination? You don't think I can carry a thing like that in my head forever, do you?"
"No," she said. She smiled curiously, and one hand slipped into the bodice of her dress. "I don't think you ever did memorize that combination, but perhaps you will recognize it again, the original in your own handwriting." She held up a crumpled piece of paper before him, then tossed it on the table.
"Where did you get that?"
he demanded roughly. Her shoulders lifted mockingly again. "There are other secrets in this room beside that door and the tunnel to the shed, aren't there, Bundy?" He eyed her now for a long minute, biting openly at his lips, his face twisted in a well simulated ugly scowl.
"So I'm to queer this game, am I?" he snarled suddenly. "And if I'm caught as a snitch, they'll tear me to pieces."
She leaned a little forward from the table, a tense, lithe thing, and her voice came low with passion. "We're wasting time, and you've none to lose. We've gone over this ground before, haven't we? It's the one chance you have to save yourself. Some day you won't be able to save yourself. Some day the reckoning will come, but you will always have the hope that it won't, and that you will always succeed in staving it off each time as you have in the past. But until that day does come, the only chance you have for life is to pit your wits against the fiends like yourself that are around you. For what you have done there is no atonement, only punishment. I mean you to live in suspense,
But even while that suspense lasts, you will pull apart and unravel your devil's work as fast as you knit it together. You have a chance that way. When the end comes and they get you, you know how the underworld will pay you, but there is the chance. That is what holds you. And with the alternative, the police, there is no chance."
She was breathing hard. She leaned back against the table, her hands gripped tightly at its edge. For a moment there was silence in the room. Billy Kane's mind was groping blindly now, as in some utter darkness. In some way, for there was no question of the genuineness of her self-assurance, her very presence here in seemingly placing herself in the Rat's power proved that she held the Rat and the Rat's life and liberty in the hollow of her hand, at her beck and call.
How? What was the secret of the power she possessed over him?
He lighted a match nonchalantly, and as he applied the flame to the half-burned cigarette, he lifted his eyes to her through the blue haze of smoke that he blew negligently in her direction.
"Sometimes," he said in a low, menacing tone, "people, even women, who grow troublesome, have been known in this neighborhood to disappear."
She laughed sharply.
"You have no time to waste in foolish words," she warned him curtly. "You know the consequences of my disappearance. You are at liberty to take those consequences any time you choose. But you do not like them, do you, Bundy?"
She moved suddenly across the room, back to the secret door through which she had entered.
"I am going now," she said steadily. "If there is murder tonight, or if any part of that plan goes through, remember."
End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Doors of the Night by Frank L. Packard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10. The Pieces of a Puzzle. Billy Kane made no effort to stop her, as she closed the door silently behind her. She was gone. The minutes passed, and he still sat there on the side of the bed, his eyes mechanically fixed on the spot, an innocent blank wall now, where she had disappeared. His face, hard and set at first, grew harder. What was he to do? There seemed to yawn before him, to have opened at his feet an abyss, bottomless, pitiless, and he tottered on the brink of it, and unseen hands reached up and snatched at him to drag him from the narrow ledge that was all that was left to him of safety. What was he to do? To go on? Every hour that he clung to this role of the Rat held a surer promise not only of desperate peril to himself, but a promise that he would find himself launched in a sea of crime, of shuddering things, of murder, of blood, of sordid viciousness, of hate. In God's name, who was this Rat, who in this hole here with its secret opening and its gnawed tunnel to the daylight made the pseudonym so apt? He clenched his hands suddenly, and rising to his feet began to pace the room. He began to see now what, strangely enough, though it should have been plainly obvious all through that day, he had not seen until she, this unknown, mysterious woman, had, herself unconscious of it, made him see. Her power over the Rat, to which he was subject in his assumed character, did not, in the final analysis, whatever the source of that power might be, materially affect the situation. It was not her threat that was the driving force that must actuate him. There was another and a far greater force which he could neither ignore nor escape. He saw that now. If the foreknowledge of proposed crime came to him, he was as guilty, if he stood idly by, as those who became the actual perpetrators of the crime. Tonight, if there was to be murder done, and it was within his power to prevent that murder, or even if it were only within his power to attempt to prevent that murder, and he did nothing, he was a murderer himself. And so tonight he had no choice. He must act. It did not seem to him that there had been any question in his mind about this in a specific way at all from the moment she had spoken of murder. But afterwards, if he went on, the crimes that Red Vallon and Karlin and their confederates would plot and that he would know of, what then? He halted by the table, and laughed in a short, harsh way, and in the dark eyes there burned a sudden fire. Was there really any question about that, either? Had there ever been? He asked only one thing in life now, and to that everything else was subordinate: to feel his hands upon the throat of the man who had murdered David Ellsworth, and who had fastened that guilt upon him, Billy Kane; to wring from that man a confession that would clear his name. Nothing else mattered. He could run for it, discard this role of the Rat, and perhaps effect his escape, but he would thereby throw away almost every hope of bringing the guilty man to justice. The other way was to fight. Well, he would fight. It would be a good fight. And as the Rat, he would not have to fight alone. If he accepted the chances as they stood, he must accept the risk involved in foiling the plots and crimes of those who thought him their confederate. But against this, the first step already inaugurated, he had the craft and cunning of the underworld at his back in the one purpose that meant anything to him now. It would be a good fight. If he failed, he might as well go out this way as any other. Better this way, for then at least some of the projected deviltry would never know fruition. He drew in his breath sharply, as in a sort of strange relief. It was settled now, once for all. He would go on, as the Rat, to the end. And tonight he would see this Merxler plot through to the end. Billy Kane picked up the crumpled piece of paper she had dropped on the table, studied it for an instant, then placed it in his pocket. It contained the scrawled figures of a safe's combination, nothing more. And now, glancing at his watch and finding that it was already a little after 8 o'clock, Billy Kane worked quickly. The mask that had served him the night before was already in his pocket, as was his revolver. To these he added the electric flashlight that Whitie Jack had procured for him that morning, and from where they dangled in the block of the door, Whitie Jack's bunch of skeleton keys. He extinguished the light, then passing out through the secret door, which he closed carefully behind him, he made his way quickly through the little underground passage, gained the shed through the trapdoor, emerged on the lane, and from there, cautiously, he reached the street. He walked rapidly now, but keeping always in the shadows, shunning the direct rays of the street lamps. He cared nothing for the police. His danger did not lie in that direction. Seen anywhere in the city by either police or plain-clothes man, he would be recognized, not as Billy Kane, but as the Rat. And the authorities, he was fairly well satisfied, had no particular or immediate interest in the Rat. His danger lay tonight in an unlucky recognition by some prowler of the underworld, the report of which might reach the ears of Red Vallon and his crowd. Supposed to be confined to bed, pleading physical inability to take his place at that unhallowed council board of which he was accepted as a member, it would be very awkward to explain his presence on the street within half an hour after Red Vallon and Karlin had left his room. Tomorrow, the day after, it would be a different matter. He could go and come then as he pleased, but tonight it multiplied his difficulties and his dangers 1,000-fold. And yet, after all, that was the most simple of the problems that confronted him. With luck, he could see his way out of that. But for the rest, he was almost like a blind man, groping his way along in what was already near to an inextricable maze. He knew something of Merxler, both by sight and hearsay. He knew where Merxler lived, that there was a will in the safe which he must secure, that he possessed the combination of the safe, and that afterwards there was the back door of Jerry's before 10, which referred undoubtedly to the notorious gambling hell of that name, and that in these fragments, once pieced together, there was murder. That was all he knew. And there was something grim and horribly ironic and mocking, and something forbidding and ominous and premonitory in the fact that he was supposed to know all. The street, for the moment, in his immediate vicinity was deserted, and just well enough within the radius of a street lamp to enable him to see, he drew the package of money from his vest pocket that the old millionaire had confided to his keeping the night before. He selected several bills of the smaller denominations, placed them in his trousers pocket, and returned the package to the inside pocket of his vest. Thank God for the money! He had enough in the bank twice over to replace this 2,000 that now belonged to the Ellsworth estate, but he could not get it. He was a fugitive from the law. But this should see him through. By the time 2,000 was exhausted, he must either have won or lost. He smiled a little bitterly. Win or lose, the estate would at least get its 2,000 back. If he won, he would pay it back himself. If he lost, well, his money in the bank had probably already been attached. And now he retreated to the shadows of the buildings again as he went along. His surreptitious excursion from the Rat's den last night had, to no one who knew the East Side as intimately as he knew it, supplied him with a mental map, as it were, of the neighborhood in which the Rat had chosen to reside. A block further on was the Purple Scarf, a so-called Bohemian restaurant and dance hall, as lurid as its name, that for the moment was the craze with the slummers and those of New York's upper strata who aped all things Bohemian, and from early evening until early morning a line of taxis waited to snatch their share of the spoils from the free-handed and quite often hilarious clientele. It was a taxi that he wanted, without attracting any unnecessary attention to himself, a taxi that he could not stand on a crowded thoroughfare and hail. And there was, as usual, a line of them there now in front of the restaurant. He reached the corner, drew his hat far down over his eyes, stepped out into the street, and approached the last taxi in the line from the side away from the curb. The chauffeur was nodding in his seat. Billy Kane touched the man on the arm. "I want to go up to the 90s, Broadway, and probably several places after that," said Billy Kane pleasantly. The chauffeur yawned and shook his head. "I'm waiting for a party in there." He jerked his head toward the restaurant. "I got a fare." "I know you have," said Billy Kane coolly. "You've got me." He extended a $10 bill. "There's another one just like this, perhaps more than one, coming later, on top of the fare." The chauffeur grinned, pocketed the banknote, and leaning out, opened the door. His grin broadened. "What did you say the address was?" he inquired. "The one I gave you will do for the present," Billy Kane answered quietly. "I'll let you know where to stop. Get up there as fast as you can. I'm paying for speed tonight. Get the idea?" "Leave it to me," said the chauffeur. "Hop in." Billy Kane settled back in the seat. The car swung out of the line, shot forward, and took the first corner on little better than two wheels. Billy Kane smiled grimly. Between here and that purposely vague address in the 90s which he had given, the chauffeur could very obviously be depended upon to do his part. In the meantime, and for the first time, Billy Kane, had an opportunity to study those scattered pieces of the puzzle in detail. He lighted a cigarette. That there should be a will in Merxler's safe at all had a nasty look, unless it were Merxler's own will, which was altogether too highly improbable a supposition to be entertained seriously. And besides, in that case, what was Karlin's and Red Vallon's and the underworld's interest in the matter? He shook his head decisively. The existence of a will did not tend to place young Merxler in an enviable light. Merxler's uncle, a man by the name of Theodore Rodgers, who had died some few months before, had been quite an intimate friend of David Ellsworth. That was where his, Billy Kane's, personal knowledge of Merxler came from. He had met Rodgers several times at the old millionaire's home, and once he had met the nephew there as well. The two did not get on very well together. Young Merxler was a notorious high roller. Left a large fortune by his father 2 years ago, he had squandered it to the last copper. Theodore Rodgers, his uncle, had time and again, both privately and publicly, stated that he would have nothing more to do with the boy. That was the gist of it. It had occasioned some surprise, then, that when Rodgers died, it was found that he had taken no steps to keep his money, what he had of it, some $60,000 or $70,000, out of the young spendthrift's hands. But no will had been found. Rodgers was a bachelor. Young Clayton Merxler was a dead sister's only son, and Merxler had inherited as next of kin, and had promptly moved his family, he was married, into his late uncle's residence. Billy Kane finished his cigarette and finished still another, as the taxi made its way uptown. There had never been anything criminal, so far as was known, about young Merxler, nothing wrong up to now, except that he had gone the pace, and that, perhaps more than anything else, he had been a foolish and unbalanced boy and had lost his head. But now there were two very unpleasant facts that loomed up insistently. First, it was common knowledge that at the time of his uncle's death young Merxler was having an exceedingly hard time to make both ends meet. And second was the fact that Karlin was in this too. Knowing Karlin now for what Karlin really was, it looked ugly enough for young Merxler. Karlin, accepted in the upper circles in which he moved as a respected citizen and an excellent attorney, had always been trusted as a friend and the legal adviser of both young Merxler's father and uncle, which placed him now in a position where he could be a very useful, if not indispensable, confederate in assisting Merxler to enter without obstacle into the possession of his uncle's estate. The minutes passed. Billy Kane, within a few blocks of his destination, noted the cross streets carefully now, as he shook his head again. The pieces did not fit so perfectly after all. Suppose that Rodgers had left the will disinheriting his nephew, and suppose that young Merxler had found that will, and that it was in Merxler's safe now, and that Karlin was a party to it. Why hadn't the will been destroyed? That would seem the obvious and safe thing to have done. And if Merxler and Karlin and Red Vallon were all hand in glove in the affair, where was the incentive for murder that she had spoken of? Whose murder? There was a snarl in the thing. He was conscious that he had not untangled it at all to his satisfaction. He tapped suddenly on the glass front, signaling the chauffeur, and as the taxi drew up at the curb he stepped quickly to the sidewalk. "Wait here for me," he directed, and started at a brisk pace up the block. He turned at the first corner, heading east along the cross street. It was purely a residential neighborhood here. There was no other pedestrian in sight for the moment. Merxler's house was one of a row halfway up the block. Billy Kane's pace became a nonchalant stroll. He passed the row of houses slowly, though apparently indifferent to their existence, and then, retracing his steps quite as negligently, slipped suddenly into the shadows of a flight of high front steps, and the next instant was crouched against the basement door. A skeleton key from Whitie Jack's comprehensive assortment crept into the lock. It proved abortive. Billy Kane, as he made a second attempt with another key, was subconsciously rehearsing certain details in his mind. There was a light in the vestibule or front hallway above him, but the windows on that floor were dark. Above that, again, the windows were lighted, and it was a fair presumption that the family proper were all upstairs. There was probably a maid, but as there was no sign of life here in the basement, it might well be her evening out. Again Billy Kane selected another key, still another, and then the door opened silently under his hand. He stepped inside, closed the door noiselessly behind him, and stood listening. There was no sound and no light. It was pitch black. He could not have seen his hand before his eyes. And then his flashlight winked through the black, went out, winked inquisitively again, and he moved forward. The stairs were just at his right, and made a right-angled turn halfway up. He gained the stairs and began to mount them, testing each separate tread cautiously before the next step was attempted. Stairs before now had been known to creak out discordantly. Billy Kane smiled in a grim, mirthless way. He was becoming an adept at this burglarious trade, where silence was so prime a factor. Since last night what was that? He felt his muscles, as though without volition of his, strain suddenly and grow rigid. He was halfway up the stairs now, and he drew back into the angle made by the turn, his body hugged tight against the wall. What was that? He thought he had heard a sound as of someone moving in the hall above, but it was gone now, and there was only a stillness in the house, a stillness that as he listened became exaggerated until it seemed to possess noises of its own, that began to throb and pound and palpitate and make his eardrums ring, and no, there it was again, A light, quick step, and unmistakably now upon the topmost stair. It was inky black. He could not see. He pressed still closer, flattening himself against the wall. The step was very light, scarcely audible. A woman's step, probably, and probably the maid's. Billy Kane held his breath. If he were found here, discovered, caught, the Rat would... He did not care to dwell upon the consequences. Something, a shapeless thing, a deeper, shadowy blackness, passed by him. It seemed to escape contact with him by the barest fraction of an inch. He heard the sound of breathing, then a step along the passageway below, and the basement door closed quietly. There was silence again, save for that din infernal that beat at his eardrums. He lifted his hand to his forehead. It was moist as he brought it away again. A moment more, and he was grimly composed again. It was the maid, probably. That seemed the natural conclusion. Who else would have gone out by the basement door? Well, if that were so, he was left now with almost unrestricted freedom of action. The family being all upstairs, he might reasonably expect to have the first floor quite to himself without very great fear of interruption. He crept on up the stairs, and reached the main hallway. Here the dim light in the vestibule, sifting down the length of the hall, metamorphosed the blackness into a murky gloom. He listened again. A murmur of voices came intermittently from above. There was no other sound. There was a door at his right. He opened it silently, and stepped through into the room beyond. He closed the door, and the flashlight winked out again. He was in luck now. This, at the first venture, was the room he was looking for. The round white ray of the flashlight, cutting a filmy path through the darkness, fell upon the nickel dial of a small safe that stood against the opposite wall. He crossed to the safe, knelt before it, and took the crumpled piece of paper that bore the combination from his pocket. Thereafter, for a moment, as his fingers moved swiftly, the silence was broken by the faint musical whirling of the dial, and then a slow metallic thud as he shot the lever over, and the safe door swung open. The ray from the flashlight flooded the interior of the safe. It was a small safe, but even so it was evidently more than large enough for its requirements. On the floor of the safe was a package of securities, held together by broad elastic bands, but the pigeonholes were sparsely filled, some being entirely empty. A few minutes' examination disposed of the pigeonholes, and the skeleton keys came into service again on the little locked drawer. The drawer contained a single envelope, sealed. He slit the envelope open. It contained two folded sheets of paper. He examined only one of them, and that only to the extent of glancing at the first few words: I, Theodore Rodgers, being of sane mind and... Billy Kane's face darkened as he thrust the envelope into his pocket and locked the drawer. It was true, then. His lips pursed grimly as his eyes fell upon the package of securities again. He took up the package and riffled it tentatively through his fingers. Theodore Rodgers had perhaps been a little eccentric, if eccentricity was defined by a divergence from the general habits and customs of others. He had made no secret that he kept his securities in his own safe, preferring that method to depositing them in a safe deposit vault, and claiming that, as the securities were made out in his name, and were therefore valueless to anyone else, they offered no temptation for robbery. Young Merxler had evidently followed in his uncle's footsteps in this particular. But Theodore Rodgers had been credited with being worth in the neighborhood of $70,000. Billy Kane's lips pursed tighter as he replaced the package of bonds and stock certificates in the safe, and closed and locked the safe. At a generous estimate, there remained no more than $12,000 or $15,000. Young Merxler, in the brief period following his uncle's death, had evidently done well. Billy Kane retreated from the room, descended the stairs, and let himself out through the basement door. And 5 minutes later, in his taxi, was being whirled downtown again. The back room at Jerry's before 10. He had directed the chauffeur to drive to a side street just off the Bowery near Chatham Square. That was close to Jerry's. He had looked at his watch as he had entered the taxi. It was just 9 o'clock. He had therefore plenty of time now. He took the envelope from his pocket and extracted the two folded sheets. There was not light enough to read by, but that was quite easily rectified. He had his flashlight. He bent down toward the floor of the cab so as not to attract the chauffeur's attention, read both of the papers, read them again, and a look of stunned surprise and bewilderment settled on his face. One was a will, evidently drawn and written by Rodgers himself, and duly witnessed, bequeathing practically everything to charity, and specifying 4 or 5 different organizations as the beneficiaries. It appointed Karlin, who was referred to as a trusted and lifelong friend, the sole executor, and, as a mark of personal esteem, and as a slight compensation for the administration of the estate, left Karlin a legacy of $2,500. The other paper was a letter signed by young Merxler. Billy Kane read this again for the 3rd time.
If I die before Karlin does, this is a joke on Karlin. If Karlin dies before I do, the will and this letter go into the fire. Damn him, I hate him. He's a smooth, oily-tongued hypocrite. It was Karlin, more than anybody else, who backed my uncle up in the idea of cutting me off. Well, I guess this is where I get even. If there's $2,500 left when I get through, I hope Karlin will enjoy it. But there won't be. I just wanted him to know how thoughtful my uncle was. And it was worth the risk of keeping the cursed will for the sake of the jolt it will give Karlin's miserly, sniveling soul. If there's anything Karlin loves, it's money. If Karlin's got any god at all, it's money. He worships that, all right.
Here the letter veered abruptly into direct address.
It'll break your heart, Karlin, won't it, to think I spent $2,500 of your money? That's the joke, Karlin. It's rich, isn't it? And I just want to tell you, too, that you had the will in your own hands once and overlooked the bet. That's where you slipped up, Karlin. It was the day my uncle died, and we were going over the papers together. It was in a plain, unsealed envelope, and didn't look like anything. You tossed it on a heap of other stuff to be looked into later. All you could think of was counting stocks and bonds, getting your fingers in the money, and you didn't know was yours. Well, some of it, anyway. I was looking for something else and found it. I only had to read about 2 words and see that it was my uncle's handwriting. And, well, since you're the executor, you'll find it enclosed herewith. Clayton Merxler.
Billy Kane refolded the papers, returned them to the envelope, restored the envelope and flashlight to his pocket, and leaned back in his seat. The taxi lurched and swayed along at a pace that gave small deference or heed to speed laws. Billy Kane stared out of the window. The letter was viciously facetious, callous, and unscrupulous. The boy was a self-confessed and blatantly unrepentant thief. In that, at least, his first supposition had evidently been justified, and it was quite clear now why Merxler had not destroyed the will. But otherwise, the whole affair had now assumed an entirely different aspect. Instead of Karlin being in league with Merxler, Karlin, unknown to Merxler, it now appeared, was aware of the existence of the will, and Karlin, if she had not exaggerated, meant murder, and since no one else was involved, meant Merxler's murder. Billy Kane's face hardened in perplexity. But why? What could Karlin hope to gain thereby? Certainly it was not on account of the little legacy of $2,500. Karlin had only to expose the fact that the will existed to obtain that, and that applied equally to the executorship. And what good could the executorship do Karlin? With the stocks and bonds there open to inspection and their value known, Karlin's executorship could afford no opportunity for crooked work. He could simply turn the securities into cash, turn the cash over to the various charities, and the cash must correspond with the valuation of the estate's schedule of assets. Why then murder? Personal enmity? No. Red Vallon and the underworld were interested in this, and the enmity that had caused Merxler to preserve the will, an enmity that no doubt was fully returned by Karlin, had nothing to do with Red Vallon and the rest. 5, 10, 15 minutes went by. The taxi reached the lower section of the city. Billy Kane still stared from the window, his face still hard in perplexity. Murder! No, he did not understand. But there was still the back room at Jerry's, where he was going now. Did the answer lie there? Jerry's, safely entrenched in one of the most abandoned neighborhoods of the city, was a gambling hell that had boasted a certain exclusiveness, and its patrons quite made good the boast. It was an open secret that men whose names ranked high in the city's commercial and professional world went there for their fling. Jerry, it was said, was an ex-croupier from Monte Carlo, and had brought the spirit of Monte Carlo with him. He, Billy Kane, had heard of the place often enough. The entertainment was lavish, the play unlimited. Did the answer lie there, in the back room at Jerry's? He shrugged his shoulders philosophically now, and a grim little smile came and flickered across his lips. Well, if there were any means by which an uninvited guest could gain access to that back room, he would know within a very few minutes now. End of chapter 10.